So the financial situation of the household sector is much worse, and the total credit as a percent of the economy is no longer 130%, but it's 370%, and that excludes, and they have to point out, the next big time bomb is not going to happen tomorrow, but it will be when the baby boomers retire, and in the process the entire population ages, and then Social Security expenditures and Medicare expenditures will balloon, and that will necessitate, in my opinion, much higher taxes or much larger deficits. In my view, the U.S. actually has boxed itself into a position where actually they have to inflate. Otherwise the system breaks down. It will break down anyway, but with inflation you can postpone the breakdown somewhat. Mm-hmm. And since every administration is essentially in office for 4 or 8 years, they always will postpone the problem to the next administration instead of solving the problem. That's the problem of democracy.
Well, there's a concept. Fareed Zakaria had written a book called The Rise of the Rest, and that theme, amongst other commentators, is becoming more popular. It points out that not only is the U.S. and Western Europe shrinking back on a relative basis to the rest of the world, but if you look at debt-to-GDP numbers in the developing world, they're actually much more attractive than what you'd find in Europe and in America. Maybe you can help us draw some distinctions between the highly probable outcomes and the merely potential as we look at what changes and what develops in the developing world versus in the U.S.
Well, I think, first of all, demographics are very different in the developing world, and we have a very rapidly growing Muslim population worldwide, also in the U.S., by the way, but especially so in Western Europe and, of course, in the Muslim countries of the world. And I have to stress this is not a comment that I find the population growth to be dangerous or not dangerous, just the fact that the Muslim population in the world is growing very rapidly, and the Asian population compared to the Western population is also growing rapidly, with the exception of Japan, where the population is contracting. But what is happening in the world from time to time is that you have major shifts in the balance of power. Say at the end of the 19th century, you had two developments. First of all, the rise of Germany that had a GDP that in 1910 then exceeded British GDP. That led to tensions between the then superpower Britain and the rising power, the rising industrial power Germany. They came to war. And at about the same time, the U.S. economy became dominant, and I would say the place in the sun of the U.S. then expanded after the First World War and after the Second World War. And relative to the rest of the world, probably the U.S. reached its peak in the early 1960s. And then in the 70s, the U.S. started to lose out some of its industries to Japan and to countries like South Korea and Taiwan and so forth. And now, over the last 20 years, obviously, the Western world has had much slower growth than, say, countries like India and China and the rest of Asia. And so there is a huge shift in the balance of power. All I can tell you, whenever you have these major shifts in history in the balance of power, economic power I'm talking about, then you also have huge geopolitical tensions coming up. I think the U.S. economy will eventually recover when the next world war happens.
Well, it's interesting that you would comment on that, because the dialogue with our listeners and our guests for almost 2 years now has consisted of one element or the other. We saw this as a financial crisis first and foremost, which morphed into the larger economy. So then it became an economic crisis. Then the economic crisis is in the process, we believe, becoming a political crisis. And ultimately, political crises, it looks to us in history that those are resolved in distractions and foreign wars, if you will. So pointing the finger elsewhere, not taking responsibility for decisions at home, maybe even taking some of the ruffians and putting them on the front line. But that's the solution, is ultimately geopolitical crisis. But that's worth repeating. It's your belief that ultimately the recovery in the United States will be on the other side of a major conflict?
Yeah, my view longer term is that the U.S. economy will, we had a total collapse of economic activity between last September 2008, and March, April of this year, and since then the rate of decline has slowed down. And when you have home sales and car sales way below the trend, you eventually rebound. So I think it's possible to have an economic rebound, say, in the next 6 months or even 1 year and so forth. But if you're thinking that economic activity in the world, in particular in the Western world, will go back to the peak that was probably reached in 2006, early 2007, forget about it. It's not going to go back there because the consumer is tapped out and won't have the money. And the unemployment rate is likely to come down only slowly. And so eventually, when there is an insufficient recovery, the government will, of course, never assume responsibility for what they've done. They will find a scapegoat, and or to distract the attention of the people, they will create something like we have to go to war for such and such reason, and so forth and so on. And so I think the time will come when conflicts will be much more widespread in the world than they are at the present. And we're not exactly in peace times at the present, by the way.
Well, just to wrap up, Dr. Faber, we want to thank you for joining us today, and just to communicate to our listeners how valuable your report is to us on a monthly basis. Please go to gloomboomdoom.com. That's gloomboomdoom.com, and you'll see some samplings of Dr. Faber's work. I think the most valuable part of what you do, in our mind, Dr. Faber, is this. You are a PhD economist, but it's not as if you're locked into econometric modeling and things of this nature. You're bringing insight of both a political and geopolitical nature, as well as an economic and financial nature. So being well-read, being well-rounded, puts you a little bit outside of the box in terms of your regular Wall Street crowd, which are very good at their models. You just hope that their models are right. And we thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Faber.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick, along with David McAlvany, and our guest today, Dr. Marc Faber. You can find us at McAlvany.com. That's McAlvany.com. Or feel free to call us at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.